Coming to you from the city of the weird. Exploring topics from the esoteric and unexplored to dimensions unknown. Shining a light of truth on the darkest corners of our reality. Welcome to the Curious Realm.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to the Curious Realm's continuing coverage of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Conference here in Denver, Colorado. We have the great pleasure of being joined by a friend of the show and researcher, Katherine Chiljan. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for coming.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me out. It was great to make connection with the fellowship and come out here, talk to all kinds of folks. You're actively going to be presenting here in a little while. Let's get into your presentation a little bit for the audience.
Yes, well, it's about some images of the 17th Earl of Oxford, who I believe is the real Shakespeare. And I've been researching portraits for him for a very long time. And in fact, I did find one, a 1581 portrait of an unknown gentleman that I have identified as Oxford, and it's on the cover of my book, Shakespeare Suppressed.
Okay.
And so that fired me up. And then I found actually documentary evidence that really was Oxford, in the sense that the hat that he's wearing in this portrait reflected a gift that Queen Elizabeth gave the Earl of Oxford.
Oh, wow.
Yes, after he was released from prison. And it's of the same description, so I think that pretty much proved it.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so that roused me up as far as finding other portraits.
Well, and that's just it. There is so much when it comes to forensic evidence, like you're saying, things like that, where portraits can be traced back. You can go back and trace the origin of these things and find these tiny little clues that kind of lead you down the rabbit trail of, that gentleman that we know from Stratford-upon-Avon is not the man that we know as Shakespeare.
Right, definitely. He William Shakespeare was someone's pen name.
Yeah.
And there was just so happened to be a man with a similar name, and actually the name was never spelled like the playwrights. The two got confused. And he was also involved in the theater, the Stratford man. So I wouldn't deny him an association with the theater, but there is absolutely no lifetime evidence that he was educated or was a writer or wrote anything.
Well, and that's something fascinating that we brought up in numerous interviews during this conference, is the idea that there's no growth pattern to Shakespeare. He just suddenly is. There's no hey, here's early works that really aren't that great. Here's some sketchy stuff that is just notes, that kind of thing. There are no preternatural writings. There's no beginnings of poetry or anything like that.
No juvenilia, they call it.
Yeah, juvenilia. There you go.
He just bursts on the scene in 1593 with this incredible poem called Venus and Adonis. That was the first work under the name of Shakespeare in print. And this shows somebody who was not inexperienced, very experienced author, writing in a very difficult rhyme scheme. I believe it's called rhyme royal. So he had to have other pieces of poetry to his name, but we don't know. He just bursted out in this brilliant writer.
Yeah, because iambic pentameter is not exactly something that's easy to write in to begin with. It's really kind of a style all its own. So the idea that this is really the first place that it came along and it just came out of nowhere,
right,
is kind of strange.
And also in the dedication of Venus and Adonis to the Earl of Southampton, Shakespeare writes that it's the first heir of my invention. And many people say, oh, this is his first poem.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. What he was really referring to is his invention is the pen name, William Shakespeare. And this is the first
the
heir
first thing to have.
it.
Yeah,
to it. So he was really explaining himself, actually, pretty out in the open, even though the name is a pen name. You know?
That's fascinating, and that's really interesting to think about. Now, when you're going to things like Hamlet, y'all went to a performance of Hamlet last night. One of the things we've been talking about is the idea that many Shakespeare plays, whenever you go see them, things like that, are not in their entirety because of their length. Because of their drawn-out length. So they're edited, they're changed, things like that.
Yeah, necessarily, because if you look at the more or less final versions, which are in the folio of 1623, if you did them, performed them, they would last 5 hours or more if you did every single scene and every single speech.
Yeah.
So very likely these final printed versions were something that the great author was working on toward the end of his life and enhancing and really turning it more into a piece of literature than as a play.
Well, and one of the things that we got into with Dawn here at the show was the idea of even modern theater. If you go, like, I'm a huge fan of 90s Broadway theater and the idea of even a show like Les Miserables, where scenes are changed, songs are changed. They're changed annually now, so that you're encouraged to come next year because we're going to have a different mix of songs, So when you're talking about, especially a lot of the things like the comedies being written specifically for the royal court and then performed later, the idea that it wasn't like, hey, here's your 300-page script. It was, here's your part. Here's your part, here's your part. And if this was changed for, let's say, a secondary performance at the royal court or another one, and then changed again whenever it came to the public stage, come assembly time, all those things were probably just put together, and that's why we have a 500-page manuscript instead of what they typically just performed.
Yes, I would agree. It's something along those lines of what happened.
Yeah. And, it's really interesting to see kind of almost a revisionist history point of view, just the idea of people's misunderstanding of that, of the fact that these, even with the folio, they were assembled. Nobody came in with a completed document and said, here's Hamlet in its entirety.
Well, exactly. And that's why I say that, have we really read the Shakespeare plays as the author wrote them? Because clearly the editors of the first folio did not have the original manuscripts, even though it says on the title page, that these are the pure originals. That's not true. No scholar today will tell you that was the case, because there's so many mistakes and so many strange passages, or ghost characters that are named but don't have any parts, things like that.
Well, and bumps where things just don't weld together within the story and within the scenes.
I think many of the plays are actually reconstructions of actors' parts, or people sitting in the audience doing stenography and then giving them to printers, and maybe they didn't hear everything right, but the mistake carried on.
That is a great point, because once again, printing was extraordinarily rare and expensive at the time. So to have all of this printed out, once again, like, hey, here's your 300-page script, here's your 300. It wasn't really the case, They were working off short sheets, that kind of stuff, crib note type things.
It's my dream that one day the original manuscripts will be found all together.
Wow.
Because, we don't have one page of a manuscript in the author's handwriting.
Yeah.
So I think they've been collected and maybe squirreled away somewhere.
That is one of the active theories of Oak Island.
Yes.
Katherine, is that the original writings of Shakespeare are down there. And wouldn't it be fascinating if that is what they found?
I would love it.
It would be interesting. But even then, it's the idea of, good God, why go dig a hole like that to hide the works of Shakespeare?
True.
And even then, that brings the conversation of why not change? Why the consternation in theater, in academia, all of that? You know, that when you're looking at, well, it would be ridiculous to dig a hole and put everything in there. Well, how come nobody wants to put a ladder in the hole and come out and have the conversation about the rest of it? You know,
Right.
It's pretty fascinating to see both didactic sides of that conversation. So,
Right.
Yeah, it's just one of those strange things where it's like, wow, this is. I don't think it would be anything that would greatly and hugely change history as we know it. You know.
You mean digging up what's down there, or
well,
yeah,
I mean, even revealing who Shakespeare is.
Oh, yes,
You know,
yes.
like, I don't know if he did have a tryst with the soon-to-be Queen of England and did impregnate her, then yeah, the actual crown itself, as it stands right now, wouldn't be the crown that should be there. You know, so there's kind of that,
theoretically,
I guess,
but
in theory.
400 years have passed, so I
Yeah,
don't think
yeah.
it would really be a threat.
Things would have been changed along the lines.
Yeah, actually, but for example, I often bring up the idea of Polonius being Lord Burleigh, who was one of the most powerful men in England at that time, during Shakespeare's time. And he was not portrayed in a flattering way in Hamlet as Polonius, as the counselor of the king.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's still a Cecil family today, and maybe, you know, they might be adversely affected by the truth coming out. You know, that this may have been a portrayal of their famous ancestor,
and that
the
is,
founder of their family.
That's one of the things that I've brought up pretty regularly here at the show, is the idea of it. I can understand hiding it at the beginning, because you're talking about not necessarily defaming the name of some of these people, but they were definitely inside prodding jokes that if somebody else came up to that point, they'd be like, oh yeah, remember that dude that wrote that thing? We need to go find him real quick.
Right.
You know, and all of his family who's living on that land, they just need to go away now. You know, no more vassals for them. Titles are stripped. Land comes back to the kingdom now. And I could totally see that happening in early England. I could completely see that happening if somebody who was made fun of in one of those scripts.
Well, also there was the succession that was of interest too. And if you look at the Shakespeare sonnets, many, including myself, believe that the young man, or the fair youth of the sonnets, was the Queen's child. By the Earl of Oxford. So, and that's my personal opinion. I think that's what many of the sonnets are all about, the succession. And when the sonnets were published in 1609, a lot of nobles were not happy with the new king, James. He had been on the throne about 5-6 years. And so if it were known that the true author of the sonnets, and this was published under the name of William Shakespeare, if they knew that that was really the pseudonym of a nobleman who was in the know, who was very close to the Queen, and that they could read into the sonnets that this fair youth was really the Queen's child, and maybe he is somebody eligible for the throne. So that would be another reason to hide. The true identity of the author.
Precisely. Now, you're actually working on new research right now for a new book. Let's dive into that for the last few minutes.
Well, I'm not really going to talk about it, but deeply, because I'm not finished.
I don't want you to give it all away.
But
either.
I think it's where art and the Shakespeare authorship kind of come together. And so that's what I'm going to do.
And there was a whole presentation in there about things like that a while ago, about paintings and their significance to the world of William Shakespeare, and how they were inspired by it, and things that they may, like you were saying, the hat in the image that you're talking about in the beginning of the interview, that can be traced back as a gift from the Queen of England.
And there's also the Ashbourne portrait, which is now at the Folger Shakespeare Library. That shows a man holding a beautiful jeweled book with his one hand or his wrist on a skull. And so many people, whenever the portrait was discovered in the 19th century, since then, a lot of people thought that this was a portrait of Shakespeare and an allusion to the sonnets, which would be the jeweled book.
Sure.
And then his wrist resting near the skull would be an allusion to that scene in Hamlet.
Yeah.
Where he looks at York's skull and talks about death.
Exactly.
So, the portraiture is very important. And in my talk today, I am going to bring up a few other portraits that I think are Oxford that most people are not aware of.
Well, tell our audience about those a little bit.
Well, one is a painting of a young courtier dressed in a beautiful courtier's outfit, and he's opposite of an aged man, and below them is a skeleton, and in between them are Bible verses. I mean, it's a really fascinating picture. And back in the 80s, somebody commented, an auction house, that it resembled the Earl of Oxford, the young man. So that really got my attention. And it turns out that there are at least 5 versions of this picture. So
interesting.
And then you look closer at the picture, and it looks like these figures are standing on wooden floorboards with fancy framed signs that are on nails. So it could be a man on stage. This may have been a theatrical production.
Interesting.
Involving the Earl of Oxford,
Interesting.
and the earliest known version, they date to circa 1575, when Oxford was in his 20s. So
wow.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting thing.
That is fascinating. And we know that the Earl of Oxford was, a patron of the theater.
Yes.
We know that the Crown was a patron of the Earl of Oxford.
Well, yeah, at least from 1586 onwards, he received a £1,000 a year annuity from the Royal Exchequer. So that was very significant.
Yeah. Yeah, and one that wasn't really to be questioned or looked into, according to the grant of the grant. Like, don't worry about what this does, just give it to him. And it's pretty fascinating to hear that.
Well, I think it had something to do with also maybe, compensating him for all the plays at court that he provided. Like in 1577, I believe there was a play called The History of Error. And that was before the Queen and her court. Well, we also have a Shakespeare play called The Comedy of Errors, right?
Yeah.
So that's just one example. There are many others that I wrote about.
How frequently, I mean, at least from what we see with things like that, how frequently was the court commissioning pieces like that to be done? Were they commissioning pieces for other reasons, just for entertainment? What were these?
Well, I think
commissioned pieces for?
Initially they were paid for by the Queen, the production, some of it, but it was the Earl of Oxford writing for it, and I don't think she was paying him for doing that. So I think that subsequently ended up in the £1,000 grant. But also, as you were alluding to, there are some plays that do affect patriotism. And also the history of England. So I think that those were eventually performed before the public with the intention of making people proud of England.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Yeah. The same way we put out movies in the same way.
Yes.
I'd love to say propaganda doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But it does. It's
a
there.
Very long history.
And it's there. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's nothing new. And that's what I think a lot of people don't realize is like, there were plays in ancient Greece that were propagandistic, talking about the enemies and, how to treat them and things like that.
But if you ask the typical English professor, they'll say, he was just writing for his meal. He's writing for bums on seat.
No, just to bring the people in.
Just to bring the people in.
And, with that being said, we have a few minutes left. How do we begin to, I guess, turn the tide? How do we begin to shed light on this? How do we begin to have these academics that naysay all of this begin to actively, just look at actual historic fact?
Well, they won't. Unfortunately, they're really entrenched in their point of view, and I've been in this almost 40 years, and there's been no real change. So I think it is really beholden to the general public to start clamoring for answers, clamoring to these people who are the gatekeepers of Shakespeare, and shows. That's why I'm on shows like yours. And
that's why I love having you on.
Yes, because we need to get the average person involved, and there's been a great misjustice here for someone who wrote probably the greatest literary works that were ever written.
Yeah.
Right. So he deserves justice.
Well, and it's also that fact of I think right now in our society, it's very interesting to see this. It's not even a gap. It's almost a generational chasm when it comes to things like this. And being able to, I think that there's some great hope that as older professors move out and those that are my age become professor and that kind of stuff. Those in their 40s, 50s are moving into those positions of tenure. I'm hoping that there will be a seed change, that there will be a want to look at things with new eyes through the actual lens of history. Just the common sense lens of history. Things like, okay, so a commoner in the 1600s was able to read and write. Noted.
Commoner with no education.
With no
right.
Yeah.
No court connections.
And that's just it. There's things like that where it's like, wait a minute. It's kind of the same way I feel whenever I talk about the Great Pyramids on the show. It's like, I love Egyptology, but if this was a tomb, where are all the religious scriptures that are supposed to be all over the wall to get the king's soul to the stars? Without those religious scriptures on the wall, this is a big box to hold his soul here and to never let him attain the afterlife. Because there's magical spells from the Book of the Dead that are supposed to be there for his spirit to come out and read so his heart can be weighed against the weight of a feather. Those are nowhere in the Great Pyramid. So Egyptology is telling us without these things, a king goes nowhere, nobody's soul goes anywhere. But yet still you're telling us it's a tomb. And the two just don't jibe. They don't shake hands. They don't add up. And much like, okay, so you're telling us this guy who apparently never released anything before this first amazing poem, just woke up one day, knew how to read and write like that.
Yeah, well, that's essentially what the professor's telling us. That it was really like automatic writing. It came from a spirit or God. And he just wrote it down.
No, precisely. And it's one of those like, wow, you couldn't ask for more spectral evidence. Quite literally spectral evidence, because it's strange when history doesn't match up like that. And even talking with Don yesterday on the board, who was a theater history teacher, It was like the day that it hit me that, wait a minute, none of what I'm teaching in theatrical history about this actively matches up with history.
Yes.
There's something totally wrong there.
Yes.
So to see, I've seen more than one young person here, more than one person in their 20s, things like that. So the fact that this is being looked at, being courted by people of that age, I think gives us a great deal of hope for the fact that this research will continue, it will go on, because that's something that I bring up at a lot of conferences that I go to. How do we move it into the next generation? How do we bring what has literally been a library of research and research done in a library, things like this, to the digital world, so that it's not only accessible, but so that, the internet was not made for cat videos. Catherine, as much as I love my show, it wasn't even made for that. It was made so that people could share data. It was made so that academics and labs could in real time share data, because research does not occur in a vacuum. Even research on vacuum science doesn't occur in a vacuum. Like, you have to have other researchers. You've got to be able to bounce ideas off people. That's why conferences like this are massively important.
Yes.
Massively.
And that's why we need, to constantly bring in new people, younger people. That's what drew me in, because I was in my 20s. Yeah. And I saw that most of the people who came to conferences were like in their 60s or older. So I kind of felt that I had an obligation, I always akin it to, I'm a fourth degree Knight of Columbus, and I always akin it to whenever I walk into a Knights of Columbus hall somewhere that doesn't know me, and they're like, oh, look at this young buck. Somebody buy him a beer so he stays around. And it's like, hey, I'm 49. I think it's the next demographic that you want to be bringing in. Yeah. Not necessarily me at age 50, where I'm like on your coattails. Like, you want to bring people 20 years younger than me in, so that this research continues to continue, and so that they can invigorate the other youth to get into it, to check it out. It's been great to, as you know, we talk about a lot of really strange topics on this show, but it's been very interesting, even since we've started the show, to see the attitudes towards many of those topics change